Welcome back, class. Let's do a real brief review of last session where we reviewed chapter 14 focused on William James. We saw that William James was a pragmatist, not necessarily a functionalist. We also examined the stages of U.S. psychology's development, looking at stages of moral and mental philosophy, intellectual philosophy, the Renaissance, and then ultimately functionalism, where they focused on the individual and evolutionary from an evolutionary perspective. We also examined the characteristics of functional psychology as well. Then we began chapter 15 looking at John Dewey. We understand that John Dewey's main area of interest was that of education. That was the key area that he thought we as functionalists would focus on to develop us ourselves as human beings as well as to produce a better society. He also examined experiential learning, where learning takes place. It sort of built up to what his philosophy of education was all about. And then that had as a key component to it pragmatism. And that's where we'll pick up now where we left off discussing pragmatism. Dewey did not consider himself a pragmatist, but rather he saw himself and his philosophy as an instrumentalism. Instrumentalism, concepts and theories are measured as useful not by whether they are true or false, but by how effective they are in explaining and predicting phenomena. So get that understanding. Not by what is true or false. That was beside the point. True or false. But how effective it was at explaining something or predicting something. The true or false, that was the question beyond them from that perspective. They just want to know, did it do what it set out to? So, looking now at his educational philosophy, how does this impact his view of education? He does this impact his view? Well, students need to learn practical, pragmatic, daily life skills in order to build a better society. Again, so we see this functional psychology and education being the cornerstone of it here, or the core of it, and how it sort of leads out from that into influencing society as a whole. Dewey wanted students to learn through experience and to think and reflect critically on their experiences. So here are some examples just to clarify. Math could be learned by cooking, traveling, or building things. Obviously, if you've ever cooked, you have to use measuring cups. There are things sometimes you have to convert. Traveling miles to kilometers, building things, obviously, you'll have to understand a lot of calculations in order to accomplish these tasks. History could be learned by experiencing field trips, going to museums. Reading can be learned through independently selected literature. So these are ways in which we learn by doing things, by doing normal everyday things. So it's not segmented like in a certain class. So we don't isolate math, where we don't understand how math can actually be used. By doing it this way, how do I use this becomes quite obvious. So the current day evidence of his theory, those who would probably be very supportive of his ideas in today's currency, we see vocational technical schools. They are very much aligned with that basic idea. Having taught at community colleges for many, many years, that's one of the key points that is emphasized there, that they're teaching people to go directly into certain types of fields or certain types of occupations. Use of the scientific method in classrooms, kinesthetic learning, role-playing, non-traditional learning techniques, and integrating technology into lessons. All of these serves as current day evidence of some of his notions of how the philosophy of education should be employed. So we'll end with this, and we'll revisit Dewey a little bit later, but now let's look at some other functionalists. So, a few other individuals that we want to have a quick look at, including Mustenberg, Hall, Angell, Carr, Cattell, Woodworth, and Thorndike. So, Hugo Mustenberg disagreed with William James, on many points regarding behavior and consciousness. He said that behavior causes ideas rather than ideas cause behaviors, as James had stated. Mossberg, was one of the first applied psychologists. He studied clinical psychology, and he wrote books on forensic psychology and industrial psychology. And as we saw previously, he had some interest as well in film and how that gestalting view could be employed. Now, a student of his, Mary Whitten Calkins, attended seminars with James and worked with Mossberg in his research. She took unofficially the PhD examination but couldn't receive her degree. We've talked about this a couple of times too. In the early days of psychology, psychology is not an isolated discipline. It was part of society, and at that time society really did not treat women equally. I'm not saying it does now, but definitely it was not the case then. So someone could do all the work and even take the examination that should have earned her right to have a PhD conferred upon her, but that's not what was going on at that time. So she could not receive her degree. She developed several things that did not slow her down. She developed a paired associate technique to study the influence of frequency, recency, and vividness of memory. She also is very much responsible for the development of areas of theory focused on self-psychology, which was her major contribution to psychology. Then we have Granville Stanley Hall. He organized the first psychology laboratory in the United States, founded the first psychological journal, the American Journal of Psychology. He helped organize and was the first president of the American Psychological Association and president of Clark University. And we heard of him a little bit earlier in lecture when we covered Freud. He was the individual who invited Freud to attend a series of lectures with other famous psychologists, and this is one of the areas that really led to Freud becoming very, very much a popularized individual. Granville Stanley Hall also recapitulation theory states that the development of an individual through their lifetime mirrors the evolution of the species. Ideas on developmental psychology are greatly influenced by this particular theory. His work in this area did much to stimulate educational psychology and start the child development movement in the United States. Again, what we're seeing with these functionalists here is this common theme. Their work and their interests are allied with sort of practical applications. How does this thing, psychology, help advance us to survive, to prosper? And so here we see this portrayed in the work that these other individuals, these other early functionalists are proceeding to accomplish. So he had several ideas about adolescence, including ideas about sexual behavior, religious conversion, sex-segregated schools, and so on. Hall focused on the study of developmental psychology and the end of life. A key thing that we see in developmental psychology, the way it's done at most schools, it focuses from the conception all the way to death. So we see some important aspects of the work they did and how they also helped to develop the psychology as we see it today. Then we have Francis Sumner. Francis Sumner, he was Hall's last graduate student and first African American to receive a PhD in psychology. He argued for segregated higher education. However, there is some evidence that indicates that his public statements did not match his private beliefs and activities. The key thing there that he was attempting to try to receive funding for African American schools in higher education. He developed the psychology department at Howard University into a major center for training African American psychologists. Then we have Kenneth Clark, who also trained with Sumner. Both he and his wife, Mamie Phipps Clark, obtained their PhDs from Columbia University. They did pioneer work in the developmental effects of prejudice, discrimination, and segregation on children, and they were extremely instrumental in the efforts to desegregate the school systems. You may be familiar with one of the studies they performed dealing with the black and white baby dolls. And so we won't go into detail there, but they're the ones responsible for that research. And that research to some extent was used to help end segregated school systems. Hall's legacy at Clark University in 1908, as I mentioned earlier, Hall invited prominent European psychologists to Clark for its 20th anniversary. That was Wundt, Freud and Jung. Wundt did not show up because he had a prior engagement, but Freud remarked that this visit did much to further the acceptance of his theory around the world. Now, functionalism at Chicago, let's go back to John Dewey. So, John Dewey wrote about the reflex arc concept, and you recall we mentioned this previously. Many think that this marks the formal beginning of functionalism, this particular paper here. He proposed that there are three elements of the reflex. Okay, a common reflex, there's a stimulus, a reaction that happens because of it. So he proposed that the three elements are sensory processes, brain processes, and motor response. Sensory processes bringing things in, brain processes going toward to be processed in the brain, and motor response, what do we do about it? But his ad was this: these three elements of the reflex must be viewed as a coordinated system directed toward a goal. This goal is usually related to the survival of the organism. So again, we see that concept, which was very key to the functionalist school. Whatever they're going to be doing needs to have some direction toward survival of the organism. So the goal is usually related to survival of the organism. Any attempt to understand stimulus and response that ignores their functional interaction, he would say, was doomed to failure. So he saw that they were making a major faux pas, as it were, and talking about the reflex arc, the reflex, without talking about why, the goal, and tying all the things together as an integrated whole. So he was influential in creating what came to be called progressive education, which stated that education should be student-centered or student-oriented, not subject-oriented, and students should learn by doing. And also involved, as you would imagine, the various liberal causes. We'll see a little bit more about John Dewey when we get back with a little bit more in-depth look at the idea of the reflex arc and why he thought there was a problem with the way it was being thought of. So Darwin also mentioned faculties. Faculties hypothesized pre-existing mental structures, each one is associated with a specific process or function, and it influenced by Darwin's evolutionary theory. He basically would state that ideas are understood in terms of tangible effects that their truth would have on the empirical world. Again, the idea that drives this perspective is the outcome, okay? Tangible effects, okay? And that's going to be having some sort of truth would have on the empirical world. So the tangible effects in the real world was a key driving factor. That's what the functionalists were looking for. James Angell presented three major points of functionalism. Functional psychology is interested in mental operations, not conscious elements. Mental processes mediate between the needs of the organism and the environment. So here we see a mental aspect here. Mental processes mediate or are between the needs of the organism and the environment. Mental function help the organism to survive. Mind and body cannot be separated. They act as a unit in an organism's struggle for survival. So again, we would see a little bit of contradiction here for Rene Descartes, which we talked about previously. But in this perspective, mind and body cannot be separated. They act as a unit in an organism's struggle to survive it. So there's an integration there, as opposed to separation that we saw from the earlier philosophers. Harvey Carr. Because learning is a major tool used in adjusting to the environment, it was a major concern of functionalism. Of course, we've seen this already, particularly when it comes to John Dewey. Education being one of the key items that he really proposed as his area of functionalism. Carr proposed the adaptive act, which has three components. The adaptive act. A motive that acts as a stimulus for behavior, such as hunger or thirst. An environmental setting or situation in the organism is in, and a response that satisfies the motive. So a motive that acts as a stimulus for the behavior, the hunger or thirst, an environmental setting or situation the organism is in, and then a response that satisfies the motive. This is his adaptive act. So let's looking at James Cattell. He proposed that psychology should be applying its methods in all human activity because that is what humans do. Through his many editorships and ownerships of journals, he advanced the discipline of psychology, and particularly functional psychology, from this particular point of view. Robert S. Woodworth, interested in why and what were people's behavior, particularly their motivation. He called his brand of psychology dynamic psychology. He formulated the symbols SOR to include the organism, and particularly the organism's motivation. His text, Experimental Psychology, remained the standard text in experimental psychology for more than 2 decades around that time. And then we have someone that we're familiar with again, Edward Thorndike. He used the apparatus called a puzzle box to study trial and error learning using cats. He made the following conclusions. Okay? Learning is incremental. It happens in small steps and small stages. Learning occurs automatically without being mediated by thinking. We learn things even when we're not focused on learning them. We learn automatically. And the same principles of learning apply to all mammals. Think about what that means. Principles of learning apply to all mammals. These were very powerful words to be making and stating by Edward Thorndike here. And it sort of sets the stage for a lot of things to follow. So he developed psychology's first major learning theory, which basically combined associationism and hedonism. Mainly he considered the law of exercise and the law of effect. The law of effect states the following. If an association is followed by a satisfying state of affairs, it will be strengthened. If it is followed by an annoying state of affairs, it will be weakened. The law of exercise states that the more often an association is practiced, the stronger it becomes. Thorndike went on to abandon the law of exercise and discarded the second part of the law of effect. But again, it did have some repercussions that you would see a little bit later as others would pick up this and develop it ultimately into areas of operant conditioning by B.F. Skinner, for example. So identical elements theory of transfer states that the extent to which information learned in one situation will transfer to another situation is determined by the similarity between the two situations, sort of a transfer of training in a way. And then, of course, the other thing deals with animal research. All right, the idea is that George Ramons studied animal intelligence, but was accused of attributing human thought processes to non-human animals, which is always a danger when you are dealing with animals. You may see their behavior and give it more qualities of humanness than it would really justify. So they were trying to avoid that. So we see the following. Conway Morgan sought to correct Roman's problems of that. So in no case may we interpret an action as an outcome of the exercise of a higher physical faculty if it can be interpreted as the outcome of the exercise of one which stands lower in the psychological scale. What it basically means is this. When we see some sort of behavior an animal may do, we don't want to attribute it automatically to a higher mental state. We attribute it to the lowest mental state possible. So we don't try to avoid putting human qualities into animal behavior. He wanted to avoid the belief that non-human cognitive processes are the same as those of humans. So animal research before Thorndike and after, we saw Margaret Floyd Washburn publish several books and articles on animal psychology. In her book Animal Mind, Washburn inferred consciousness in animals at all phylogenetic levels relating to evolutionary development or diversification. So one of the key things I want to highlight here, especially when it starts with Thorndike, is that it really opened up the gate, so to speak, to do a lot of research utilizing animals. But here we can take the next step. In doing the research with animals, we still also learn about us lowly old humans as well. So beyond functionalism, a couple of things here. James Mark Baldwin, he co-founded the Psychological Review with Cattell. He was one of the first editors of APA Other's flagship journal, the Psychological Bulletin. And then finally, just to cover some of the basic ideas that we want to make sure we understand dealing with John Dewey and functionalism. So functionalism and pragmatism, he preferred instrumentalism. All right. Structuralism was to codify structural elements and basic sensations. Functionalism, no such thing as elements. The focus was on processes and functions. Dewey, processes, not structures, not intrinsic characteristics, but function. Therefore, memory is not a thing, a faculty, but a process. Memory is a process. Functionalists only understood in terms of connected processes. So again, we're going away from the structuralist perspective, and even the Wundtian to an extent, but we're looking at what it does for us. Again, remember the key thing that we mentioned before. Functionalist is about what psychology does for us. How does it aid us in developing, adapting, and surviving? A couple of other ideas. Dewey and functionalism. We saw that there were no real differences, according to the functionalists, between mind, body, thought, and action. No real differences, but only in the functions. So the key idea here is that we look at the structure and they are integrated, and that's the key thing, and they're serving to accomplish certain functions. Dewey's approach is influenced by Darwinian influence, evolutionary theory, adapting to the environment, focus on the functions they perform, not structures. Pragmatism influence, apply to ideas, have to be understood in terms of tangible effects that their truth would have to have on the empirical world. Again, going back to that idea of cash value. So, Dewey's approach influenced by Hegel. Hegel's influence, how can opposed entities be reconciled? There's this idea of synthesis. Viewed each side of a dichotomy not in opposition to one another, but in a symbiotic relationship with one another. Two sides of a dichotomy are a system in which both are indispensable. The dialectic in action, thought and action, they are not two separate things opposed to one another, but two sides of the same coin. Thought is what we express in action, and action is the expression of thought. Now looking at mind-body. The mind requires the body for its own expression. So in this instance, he's sort of suggesting the notion that, unlike what Descartes was saying at the very beginning when we talked about philosophy of mind, body being separate, here the mind requires the body for its own expression. The dialectic is the following concept. A concept contains within itself the seeds of its opposite, and that it can only be understood in relation to the opposite. So mind, body, thought, action, thin, fat, pretty, ugly. We understand pretty by understanding what ugly is. We understand fat by understanding what thin is. All right. So I guess in a nutshell, what we're suggesting here is that we need to understand about this notion of integration that the functionalist here, that Dewey was sort of suggesting. So let's go back and revisit one other idea. The reflex arc. Considering the last couple of slides we just observed, the reflex arc, he saw that concept of the reflex arc as being flawed. He saw stimulus response similar to mind-body relationship. We must examine the reflex arc in functional terms. Stimulus response are intimately connected with one another and only defined in terms of reciprocal connections. The response determines the nature of the stimulus. You hear a sound. If you go back to sleep, you say the stimulus was not fearful. You hear a sound, you get up and run away, the stimulus was fearful. So basically, the nature of the stimulus depends on the response of the organism. So these things cannot be so separated. They are integrated. There's no separate entity here. So the stimulus and the response are tied together. The nature of the stimulus depends on the response the organism demonstrates.